Good afternoon to you. I'm Nino Evangelista, and welcome to today's tropical weather outlook for August 1st, 2026. We are at the start of August now, getting into the peak of the hurricane season in the Atlantic, and very soon activity is going to start ramping up very quickly, and we are definitely continuing to progress with the hurricane season so far. So we're going to talk about what is there in the tropics to worry about as we begin the month of August, and there are a few areas, some of which I talked about yesterday, and we're going to also go over climatology and take a look at the progress of this hurricane season so far and how much activity and how much of hurricane season is there still left to track. In fact, let's get started with that by first taking a look at the graph of climatology in terms of tropical storm activity. I'm pretty sure, especially if you've been tracking the tropics for a long time, you've seen this graph multiple times before. But if not, this graph just basically represents the frequency of when we should expect the most amount of tropical storms and hurricanes to form during the hurricane season. And usually at the beginning of hurricane season, June and July, you see that the graph here does not reach very high, which means we don't really see a lot of tropical activity. And, we occasionally see a named storm or two, and that's what we've seen so far this year. We have roughly about 2 named storms down. But where you see the graph really rise is towards the end of this month, August, and especially into the first week or two of September. And this is specifically when we see the peak of the hurricane season occur, and that's when we get the most amount of tropical storm and hurricane activity to occur. And the other infamous part about the peak is, especially around August 20th, is when we especially see this graph really begin to ramp up very quickly and lead us into the peak of the hurricane season. So we are now just about 20 days away from when we should really start to see climatologically things begin to ramp up in the Atlantic. But in the meanwhile, early August, we are still getting closer and closer towards hurricane season. And specifically, what do we look at in the first 10 days of the month, tropical activity-wise? Well, especially if you've been following me since the beginning of the hurricane season, you know that I always say, early on in the season, we typically mainly focus on the Western Atlantic, like the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, if that's what you want to call it, and especially here, off the southeast coast and in the southwestern Atlantic, and occasionally some development as well in the Caribbean. And all of those spots generally see activity in early August, although we kind of see it increase as the season generally gets more active as we get closer and closer towards the peak. But since we are now in August too, we generally start also seeing our first signs of Eastern Atlantic tropical wave development with the Cabo Verde season begin to take shape. And that also especially gets even more active, and eventually we start to see the majority of our activity come from the MDR as we get closer and closer and eventually into hurricane season. And just to give you a little hint, both of the areas I mentioned off the southeast coast and in the MDR is where we actually have signals in the models right now over the next 2 weeks. But I'll go over that once again in a little bit. And I also talked about it yesterday, so kind of going to be recapping things today. What about what's happening right now, though? Nothing in the next 7 days just yet. I mentioned that the models are showing signals, but the National Hurricane Center is not noting anything in the immediate future right now that catches anybody's eyes. But of course, this is not going to last, even in a super El Nino in a year like this year, where I'm pretty sure most of you are well aware, we are not necessarily expecting a very active hurricane season. In fact, more than likely, we will be below normal. As we get closer towards the peak of the hurricane season, this graph right here, this, map, tropical cyclone activity not expected during the next 7 days, it's not going to last. Something will come along eventually. In the Eastern Pacific, though, we have Tropical Storm Genevieve here, which is weakening and continuing to weaken, and this is really not going to be much of a problem, so I wouldn't even worry and spend any time talking about Genevieve. And beyond that, nothing much else is really showing up here in the Eastern Pacific too, which is a little bit interesting, especially given the supposed pattern and the supposed setup for the Pacific this year. And August, we also really start to see things, really ramp up in the Pacific as well. But not right now. There are no other areas of interest to watch here in the Eastern Pacific and in the Central Pacific as well, besides Genevieve, which once again is on its way out of here. Here's a satellite shot of the Atlantic and the Pacific right now. This is a high-res satellite shot from NOAA. A really nice shot, honestly, and it's also shaped in the, spherical shape of the Earth, too, and I really like it. Maybe I should use it more, honestly. And you can really see all of the weather features we have across both the Atlantic and the Pacific right now, so I don't have to show you separate satellite shots of either basin. Then you can see in the Eastern Pacific some cloud cover activity, especially along the intertropical convergence zone here, although nothing is consolidating and bubbling up and looking like it is about to develop. And then way off to the left here, you could see the remnants of Genevieve and its, shell of a low-level center, which still remains, but convection continuing to fade off. And again, that's going to continue to fade off and probably wither away by the end of the weekend. And then in the Atlantic here as well, nothing too particularly interesting. We have a front that is situated off the East Coast here with some shower and thunderstorm activity across Florida and the Southeast, and also some tropical waves as well here throughout the MDR. And very interestingly enough, a huge plume of Saharan dust, which is making its way off the continent of Africa right now. Something that we still see in early August, and it's probably especially being enhanced by the conditions of the atmosphere this year. But we still have Saharan air out there, and it looks like a fresh plume is actually coming off the coast of Africa now. And let's actually take a look at that. Here's a look at the Saharan air. Still quite thick across the MDR right now. Most of the MDR, in fact, is actually completely covered in Saharan dust right now. And you can especially see all of it is, really streaming off of, the African continent and into the Eastern Atlantic here. And this is a very common factor that we typically see in the early season, especially in June and July. It peaks around July, but even as we are starting to get into August, just getting into the month of August, we still see a lot of Saharan air and dust that remains, and that generally keeps a lid on the tropics because it kind of forces convection to be suppressed. It doesn't allow for air to rise because it is dry. And also, dense and, dusty air, because it's literally dust that comes from the Saharan desert from Africa. So you can imagine that is not at all favorable for upward motion and thunderstorm activity, which is what you need in order to get developing tropical systems. So this is keeping a lid on things right now in the tropics atmospherically. And you could also see that as well, vorticity-wise, too. Nothing really interesting popping up right now. Very aggressive wave, though, coming off the coast of Africa. Quite the bundle of energy here, although, once again, with all of the Saharan air out there, I'd imagine this is going to have a very, very hard time struggling to wrap up and really try to consolidate at all. So there's nothing interesting of note to talk about in terms of any pieces of energy right now. Shear-wise, too, wind shear. Interestingly enough, though, at Eastern MDR right now, not a lot of wind shear. You can see mostly green out there. And so it looks like we're actually dealing with a little bit of a more favorable window right now, wind shear wise. And I say that because, especially in a year like this with El Nino, one of the main reasons why, honestly, El Nino is notorious for below normal hurricane season in the Atlantic is because of the fact that it usually causes very, very strong upper level westerly wind shear, and that kind of comes from a combination of things, especially because of the dynamic of the jet stream due to the atmospheric patterns with the Rossby waves and such. But no, we actually have some decently low wind shear in the Eastern MDR right now. The Caribbean, though, still also seeing the effects of the El Nino. We have quite high wind shear, and you could also see, though, there is a little bit of this wall of wind shear here that stretches from the Caribbean into the Western Atlantic here. So even if wind shear is low in the eastern Atlantic, eventually these tropical waves kind of run into a wall in which they get sheared to death. And a lot of these tropical waves will still very much struggle or completely end up dying. And that's why we especially don't really see that much activity early on, or we typically don't see much activity early on in the hurricane season anyways in any given year, except for a few freak accidents. But in an El Nino year, we in general don't see that much activity, just generally the pattern here of the wind shear. So what are we looking at, though, within the next week or the next 2 weeks in the Atlantic? And looking at the European AI ensembles here, this is the AI model. You could see, as I mentioned before, early August, where do we typically watch? Off the East Coast in the southwestern Atlantic, and for signals here beginning to come to life in the MDR. And both areas seem to have some ensemble support right now over the next 2 weeks. And I went over this yesterday, and it kind of varies from model to model, but I think the European AI ensembles here are probably the most aggressive on both signals, and they are definitely decent. You can see one area here where we have a cluster of low pressure tracks that move off the East Coast, and it seems like this actually originates from non-tropical energy associated with a trough split here in the eastern Atlantic, and the leftover energy ends up moving westward and finds a pocket of favorability in the western Atlantic. And shear-wise too, some parts of the western Atlantic are not that bad either. So maybe we might see something try to spin up here within the next week. And then taking it out to 2 weeks, you could also see that the MDR too is beginning to come to life. So you're starting to see climatology here begin to kick in a little bit. And taking a look at the GFS as well, taking it out to the next week here, you can see that there is some sort of piece of energy that tries to get going in the western Atlantic. Yesterday, the GFS was really aggressive with the piece of energy here off the southeast coast, and we actually had a hurricane develop, nearing the Carolinas coast, and then it raced on off to the northeast. Looks like the GFS has come back to its senses today. I don't want to do that. And is now just showing some sort of weak low pressure here, although you can't rule out development just yet. Some of the models are still trying to show development. Let's see if the European has loaded for the 12Z run yet. Not yet. But the 6Z run here still showed some sort of piece of energy here trying to consolidate just off the southeast coast. So we will watch it. We will see whether or not something does actually come to fruition. The models are still all over the place, but as I mentioned earlier, as we get into early August, we generally start seeing an increase of activity off the southeast coast and in the MDR. So you can't entirely rule it out just yet. And in general, it's just hurricane season after all. And we know how these, especially non-tropical origin spin-ups can sometimes come out of nowhere and even come without a lot of proper model guidance support. We kind of saw that happen with Bertha. So you can't really rule it out here entirely in this case. But regardless, nothing concrete at least over the next week, though. So for now, not yet a lot of things to worry about in the tropics, but keeping an eye out on potential signals here in the long range. Moving on to the Eastern Pacific, where if we take a look at the next week here, not much is really happening. Things are quieting down a little bit in the Eastern Pacific. Obviously, we have Genevieve here, which kind of continues to fade on off to the west-northwest and not really be much of anything concerning. Although maybe beyond 7 days, something tries to get going here in the Eastern Pacific. So the signals are going to keep coming here, but nothing particularly interesting beyond Genevieve, at least for the next week. And certainly, probably the most important part and probably the best part of everything is there seems to be no threats to land, at least for the next week. So even if there is any tropical activity here, unless something is able to magically spin up very close to the coastline here of Mexico, or maybe something spins up very close to Hawaii, although that typically never happens, or it's just very rare. But in general, no threats to land as well either in the Pacific. So things are nice and quiet, but obviously, all too well, that will more than likely not last, and eventually we'll probably have to watch out for some threats, but for now, none showing up for the moment. Taking a look at sea surface temperature anomalies across both basins right now, the Pacific, one of the biggest factors for this hurricane season, the massive El Nino out here, and that's mainly the reason why we are especially seeing things more unfavorable in the Atlantic this year, because El Nino generally focuses a lot of rising motion in the atmosphere, which in turn creates outflow, which causes very strong upper level westerly wind shear, and in general, sinking air in the Atlantic, and things are just generally not active in an El Nino year. But sometimes, and we've seen cases of this in recent years, especially if the Atlantic is able to warm up enough, we could get some of the atmospheric, there could be some sort of counteracting to whatever unfavorable conditions that the Pacific might try to impose on us, even though the Pacific this year is very warm, especially because this El Nino is increasingly shaping up to be a record warm event, record warm going back to not just the last 20 or 30 years, but more than likely going back to historical records. And yes, the historical records are, a little bit iffy. We don't have an entire clue of what might have happened in the past, because the records are probably not as good back then, but we still have records, and at least over the last 200 or 300 years, we have not seen an El Nino like the one that is currently developing in the Pacific. But meanwhile, in the Atlantic here, sea surface temperature anomalies are still warm. It's not like we have a terribly unfavorable configuration here to the SSTA pattern, especially in the Eastern Atlantic here, and I've mentioned this before. You're really starting to see the Eastern Atlantic warm up, especially off the Iberian Peninsula and Canary Current area, and that kind of tends to correlate quite a bit with active hurricane seasons when we start to get this look, but obviously a lot of that is going to be counteracted by the very strong El Nino. And just to show you how strong it is right now, the latest value from the Nino 3.4 anomaly map is up to 2.4 Celsius. So we are well above the 2 degrees Celsius super Nino threshold for this El Nino. And we are just getting into the month of August. We just started off, and I mean, this graph is actually still from yesterday. So, we are still just getting into the month of August, and we are already reaching super El Nino threshold here in the Nino 3.4. So quite an incredible event unfolding in the Pacific right now. But the Atlantic, on the other hand, as I mentioned, also warming up right now. And just take a look at how much things have warmed up here, especially since the start of hurricane season. Since the start of June, sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic were, leaning below normal. And a lot of people were especially seeing that earlier on in the year and thinking that the pattern for sure would be the most unfavorable pattern we could possibly have for the Atlantic hurricane season this year. But as always is the case for some reason, especially once we get to mid and late July, the Eastern Atlantic sees a huge rebound, and we've certainly seen that here over the last few weeks. And then I guess the last day or two, we kind of seen a blip, and a slight dip in the sea surface temperatures, and that probably has to do with the massive Saharan air plume that is surging in the Eastern Atlantic right now. And Saharan air definitely kind of artificially has an effect on satellite data and sea surface temperatures, but still, the overall trend remains the same. We have been warming in the Atlantic here for the last few weeks, and we are continuing to see that more than likely probably as we continue into now August, which is getting closer to the peak of hurricane season. So interesting things to watch here, and we will see whether or not that translates potentially into us getting a little bit of a different outcome than what some of the forecasts were for this hurricane season. So that segues into the final part here of the discussion. I'm going to release my final forecasts for the hurricane season since it's now August. We are now midway through the season, or I guess actually midway through the season would be more like September, but we are getting now into the peak. We've already had at least 2 months of hurricane season to pass by, so I'm going to give you my updated thoughts, and that's coming tonight at 8 o'clock Eastern Time right here on YouTube. So if you want to stay tuned for that, I would really appreciate you. And I hope to see you all there tonight. And if you want to stay tuned for that and you're not subscribed to the channel yet, well, I'm telling you right now, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can get the notifications for whenever I go live or whenever I upload a video the second I post it to YouTube. With that being said, though, I'm going to wrap it up for today's discussion. I hope all of you guys enjoy the rest of your day. And once again, I hope to see you all guys tonight, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. If you are in Central Time, it's 7 o'clock. Or if you're in, Mountain Time, it is 6 o'clock. If you're in the Pacific, it's 5 o'clock. Either way, I hope to see you all tonight. With that being said, though, in the meanwhile, I hope you guys continue to enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. And of course, I will talk to you again soon.